Hi everybody, it's Ajanette and I am back for part 3 of your chapter 11 lecture. And so when we last left off, we were talking about lateralization of emotion. In other words, is there a special function or role of each of the separate hemispheres within the brain? And we did determine that the right hemisphere is more likely to be associated with the behavioral inhibition system, and the left hemisphere is more likely to be associated with an activation approach, which is also more related to happiness and anger, and the inhibition is more related to fear and disgust. And then we also talked about the the right hemisphere being associated with more of the emotional processing and perception, and then the left hemisphere, the valence model suggesting that the left hemisphere is more positive and the right hemisphere is associated with more negative emotions. And we do see like higher risks of depression and things of that nature with creative individuals that theoretically have more active right hemispheres than left hemispheres. So one final concept related to lateralization of emotion is our facial expressions and the asymmetry of our facial expressions. It's been documented both in humans and in monkeys, but it seems that, facial expression appears to be begin on the left side, and then what that does is that shows that it's more of a right hemisphere domination, because the right hemisphere is what controls our motor expression in the left side of our face. So typically emotions are more obvious or observable in the left hemisphere than they are in the right hemisphere, which shows a propensity toward the right hemisphere focusing more on that emotional aspect, and the left hemisphere focusing more on that logical aspect and kind of the problem-solving elements. So, okay, so let's move on and let's talk about what are some of the functions of emotions, what purpose do they serve? If from an evolutionary standpoint, if we subscribe to Darwin's theory, there needs to be some sort of adaptive value. And certainly we can all agree that fear tells us that there's some danger or risk or threat at hand, and so it's going to alert us to kind of get the hell out of there and do something about it. Anger will drive us toward attacking and defending ourselves, maybe against an intruder or some other invader. And disgust will certainly help us avoid certain foods or activities that might cause illness or might be somehow not healthy for us. So emotions in that sense do serve a very vital function in that they can be survival cues. Additionally, they certainly help us facilitate healthy communication with others so that we can accurately read the emotions or circumstances of others, and we can communicate our needs in an adaptive way, which then is going to foster more healthy relationships and interactions with other people, and theoretically contribute to our increased survival. Additionally, emotions really can help us make very quick decisions. I know sometimes I can look at my daughter and give her a particular facial expression, or she can see an emotion in my face, and then she'll respond or adapt accordingly. And so in that sense, we can learn to be supportive of one another as well as express our needs in an adaptive way that will guide our decision making in healthy, functional ways. And although your book really doesn't talk about it, the accuracy in which we interpret emotions and we are aware of our own emotions and express our emotions in a healthy, constructive way is what we call emotional intelligence. So we are in fact able to have accurate perceptions of emotions. When people are upset, we can deduce that very quickly. We understand their emotions, and therefore we can kind of empathize with their emotions and maybe relate and communicate better on a rational level. We know how to use emotions effectively in our relationship. We're not too emotional, or we don't lack emotional expression. So we're kind of in that normative expression range. And then we can manage our emotions appropriately, and that we're not being overreactive or underreactive. And we might also use some cognitive restructuring so that our emotions aren't driving our decision making in all aspects. And an emotional intelligence is very critical element for healthy relationships, both personally and professionally. So if that's not something you feel like is your strong suit, then I highly recommend maybe you read a book on the topic, or go onto YouTube and look up some TED Talks on the topic, and maybe try to help strengthen those skills. It is something that does come naturally to some people, but I am a believer in growth mindset and learning to adapt skills and acquire skills that are going to improve your functioning overall. Okay, so let's talk about emotions and moral decisions. So there's actually a great video with Ted Hanks kind of inquiring with some researchers on these studies, but these are some dilemmas that were presented to individuals, and in addition to being presented with these moral dilemmas where they had to make a decision between killing one person or 5 people in various circumstances, they also had their autonomic responses measured. So they were measuring their heart rate, their respiration rate, their perspiration rate. And we were looking, researchers were examining what their the congruency of their physiological response, and then the way in which they answered the question and the degree of difficulty they faced in answering the questions. So they were posed with 3 different scenarios. The trolley dilemma was where he had a trolley going out of control down a track where it was on track to hit 5 people and kill them. And you could avert this by flipping the switch and directing it down a track where it would only kill 1 person instead of 5. And so the dilemma then is, would you flip the switch? Then there's a footbridge dilemma where you're on a bridge, a walking bridge, going over a trolley. The trolley's out of control and it's going to hit 5 people. Or an alternative is you can physically push this overweight person over the bridge, and ultimately the trolley is going to hit that person and it's going to stop the trolley and then save the lives of these 5 remaining people. And the lifeboat dilemma is you are in a lifeboat with a group of individuals. You're in icy water, and theoretically you guys would die in the water, but clearly the boat's overcrowded, and if you push one person overboard, then the rest of you will be saved. So are you going to push that person overboard? Are you going to push them over? Are you going to flip the switch? Are you going to push them over the bridge? Are you going to kick them out of the boat? And interestingly enough, people, as would be expected, struggle with these decisions. And individuals that have less autonomic arousal are actually more likely to make very rational decisions. And the rational decision is it's more logical to kill fewer people than more people. And so people with less autonomic response are more likely to make those decisions with less distress. So, emotions therefore hinder our ability to think rationally in this case and make decisions that would contribute to survival. So, interestingly enough, when you have the prefrontal cortex damaged, then you can in fact kind of, when we say blunt emotions, we're talking about they dampen emotions. You're less likely to express emotions or to be as emotionally expressive. It also impairs decision making, and our frontal lobe and our prefrontal cortex is largely responsible for impulse control. So when that area is damaged, we can be impulsive in our decisions. We don't often think about the long-term implications or consequences of those decisions. We are a little bit more responsive in terms of our expression of anger, but although people with damage to this area might be more impulsive, they're often much more rational when they're dealt with those trolley circumstances, those dilemmas, and they're very quick to think very rationally and not have that emotional, moral quandary, like, what would I do? They just make a decision that's very rational. Maybe it's an impulsive decision, but nonetheless, it tends to be a rational decision. So, back in, the 1800s, Phineas Gage was actually one of the most famous case studies in psychology, where he actually worked in a railroad and he was doing blasting, and this accident happened, and this was reconstructive based on his skull. But before you can see this pole was driven through his left frontal cortex there. And prior to this accident, he was just a really good guy, very respectful. He went to church all the time. He was very reliable. He was said to be, great moral, upstanding character. And after the accident, he became very impulsive. He was notoriously unreliable. He was irresponsible. He started cussing a lot, and he was much harder to be around. He was just kind of irreverent and disrespectful. And the skull was studied, and it's now at Harvard, and so you can see it there if you ever go to the Harvard Psych Lab or Psych Museum. And you see that this is largely due to the fact that the area that was damaged is involved in emotional planning and reasoning and that emotional processing that we talked about. So damage to this area, from a research standpoint, it's not ethical for us to damage these areas to specifically understand what areas of the brain are directly related to what aspects of emotional expression. But looking at case studies, we can make inferences when in fact there are cases of various areas of the brain being damaged and what the subsequent effects are on behavior and emotional expression. So in terms of other tests that have been done for moral decision making, the ventromedial frontal lobe, which is more in the middle rather than the direct prefrontal cortex, a little bit more in the middle, shows that individuals that have damage in that area tend to not feel as guilty, or they tend to not trust people as well either. So individuals with damage in that area have been subjected to a game called the one-shot dictator game, and we compare them to controls. And they're the dictator in this game. They're given a certain sum of money, and they're supposed to divide it between themselves and another person. Interestingly enough, when they have damage to this area, they end up keeping most of the money, showing a lack of trust. And the controls will typically divide the money evenly between the two people. The trust game also is given where they have to give a certain sum of, or they have to give some of the money to themselves and then some to a trustee, and that trustee can keep or return some of the money. And again, they give less to the trustee when they have damage to this area, and when they are the trustee themselves, they are less likely to give the money back. So overall, they show lower trust, and they also show less concern for other people. They don't have that sense of guilt and connection toward other people. So other areas of brain damage that have been studied are individuals that have challenges with their autonomic arousal. And interestingly enough, as I mentioned, people that have heightened autonomic arousal have more difficulty making the decision to kill the one person to save the five. And people that have lower autonomic levels are much more rational in how they approach the decisions. So when we talk about moral reasoning, although we largely associate morality and emotion, very rarely do we make moral decisions rationally. We typically will let our emotions guide us in those decisions, and then we will rationalize the decision afterward we've made it, and justify why we had to do what we had to do. But we certainly want to make sure when we're talking about making important moral decisions, we often analyze, well, how will the outcome make us feel? If it makes us feel good, then it typically aligns with our morality, so to speak. So other areas that can be damaged are the amygdala as well as the prefrontal cortex. Again, it impairs emotional processing, but people aren't able to really anticipate the outcomes, and so they are more likely to make bad decisions or poor choices that they might regret later. But they're more likely to make very rational decisions, like in terms of hitting black ice. The instinct when that we have that autonomic response is to hit the brake and try to counter the swerve, but when you hit black ice, really you should just let off the accelerator, don't hit the brake, and kind of turn into the direction of the skid, which is kind of counterintuitive. People with damage to this area are more likely to make that rational decision and follow the recommendations that they were given. Okay, so I'm going to come back and we're going to deal with attack and escape behaviors.